Welcome back, Rowan. Good to be continuing this conversation about some of the learnings from the seminar that was hosted by Malcolm Turnbull in Canberra earlier this month and some of the key learnings that come out from that. One of those was around the question of what Australia's strategy ought to be in this now much more complicated world where the potential threats are becoming more serious, but we're now far less certain about the stability and reliability of our traditional alliance with the United States. One suggestion that's emerged in Europe is what some people have called the porcupine strategy, and perhaps inevitably the Australian version of that has been described as the Echidna strategy. I wonder, Rowan, what this mean and what their potential implications in the Australian context might be.
Yeah, thanks, Saul, and good to be back continuing what I think is actually a very important conversation for our times. I do note, before I launch into your particular question, I noted that ex-Prime Minister Paul Keating was out in public today saying essentially NATO is dead and so is ANZUS. So I think the times that we're facing today are certainly fundamentally different from what we were facing even 6 months ago. The world has changed while we've been watching. And so if this is, in my view, if this is not a time of such profound change that prompts us to reconsider our national position around our national security and have a really serious re-examination of what we have held to be true and just for decades, if not multiple generations, then I don't know what's going to prompt us to do some of these things. I think there is an absolute need for some very significant re-evaluation of policies in Australia and what we think of ourselves, particularly as in the future. In respect of strategy, I'm familiar with, and it's a really interesting book to read, Sam Roggeveen's book, The Echidna Strategy on the Defence of Australia. There are elements of it I might not necessarily agree with, but nonetheless, in that sense of a contest of ideas, it's a good read. I'm reminded too, and I'll just to revisit a piece of theory that you and I have discussed previously. I think a national security strategy is what's lacking in Australia, amongst other things. That national security strategy should sensibly arise from a proper risk analysis of the risks that we face. And a national security strategy is a multifaceted thing necessarily. One part of it only is a defence strategy. Sam Roggeveen's theory, the Echidna strategy, European talk of a porcupine strategy. There are other like things. Singapore has a strategy of setting itself up to be a poisoned prawn. It knows it's tiny.
And Taiwan has something like this too, doesn't it?
It does indeed. And so the idea there being we will spend as much as we're willing to spend and we will make ourselves militarily as strong as we possibly can within the context of the fact that we are a very small player, both population and militarily, in a very congested little group of nations, most of which are probably more well disposed towards Singapore than not, whereas of course Taiwan's in a different situation. At the forum on Monday with Malcolm Turnbull, I can't now remember exactly who it was who made the comment, but I thought it was a very good comment at the time, saying, well, rather than a porcupine, which is a land animal, what we probably need is something which recognises our fundamentally maritime environment, and maybe sea wasp strategy is what we really need, something which is very, very nasty, but has a focus on the oceans. Nasty enough, it has the ability to inflict mortal damage.
And one of those jellyfish that they have in the northern waters, yes.
Fox jellyfish, that sort of thing. I do think that we have had a slowly growing realisation over maybe the last generation, perhaps a little longer than that. In fairness, Emeritus Professor Paul Dibb and Kim Beazley, that there was a very strong focus on maritime defence by virtue of the nature of our geographic and geopolitical circumstances. We're dominated by vast areas of ocean, and we need to incorporate that suitably into our defence strategy. And what might that actually mean? Well, until such time as I think we have a defence strategy that is nested within a national security strategy that responds to the critical risks that confront us from a security point of view, alighting on answers of buy more of those, sell more of these, don't buy those, do away with parts of the army. I don't think that any of those things necessarily make good sense. One of the challenges, of course, that we always face is that we are where we are. This is the ADF that we have today. This is our start point. It is the only thing that we can use as a start point. And Malcolm Turnbull made the point humorously, of course, that in respect of the ADF of today, looking at what we might be thinking that we're going to need in the future, as the famous traveller Ireland was confronted when asked, if you were going to Dublin, my friend, I wouldn't start from here. But here's indeed where we are. But we do have the opportunity to do some rethinking on many of these things. So what I don't want to do necessarily is get into answers on specific pieces of equipment. Mm-hmm. What I might do is, with your agreement, is touch on two things. And that will lead me to a statement of economics, I think, and a comment made by Richard Dennis, the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, on Monday at Malcolm Turnbull's forum. So if I start with AUKUS and the headline number, $368 billion, which of course has stunned and shocked everybody as a number. The problem with that is that we don't know exactly what that number represents. We don't know how it's made up. We do know a couple of things that give us the opportunity to look at that a little more closely. So I'll do some comparisons here with a couple of things. So we do know that from Senate estimates that of that figure, $88 billion is acquisition costs for estimates for 8 nuclear-powered submarines to be acquired over a period of probably something like about 24 years.
Of which 3 American and 5 ultimately British?
3, maybe 5 American, the remainder British, but to arrive at a force of 8, which is not a static point, right. Because as soon as you arrive at the point that you're operating 8 of these things, the first ones will be getting to the stage where you have to hand them back because they were second hand. That's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing. People criticise that. I don't think that that's a bad thing because they're not that old and they run in, proven, and will be kept by us or the Americans or whomsoever. They will be kept at top-notch operational capability, notwithstanding the fact that they might be about 15 years old, halfway through, not even halfway through their life. So their 15 years is not old when you come to a submarine. So $88 billion for acquisition. From that, and the general rule of thumb that acquisition is about 30% of the total cost of ownership. So that leaves us with an answer of something like about $205 billion, and that will be over a period of 50 years. So that brings us to $293 billion. That is 293,000 million.
That's a lot of money, yes.
But if we look at this in a budgetary sense, we do know that there is a very substantial amount of the 368 billion, which is contingency. So they've factored in a very large amount of money for things that might go wrong. And what we also don't know is how much has been factored into that 368, which is about infrastructure. So you can make some estimates about infrastructure. And it looks to me, as I do the rough arithmetic, that there's probably about $75 billion worth of contingency in that total number. That's 25%. Now, that's not an unreasonable amount of contingency to factor into your number at this point. We don't know what's going to go on infrastructure. But if I look at that on an annualised basis in a very rudimentary way, that's about $3.5 billion per annum for submarine acquisition, about $4 billion per annum, a total of $77.5 billion per annum for the nuclear submarine capability as an annualised hit to the defence budget.
Right.
Let me do some comparisons. The information that's freely available suggests that the cost to the United States of a Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarine is somewhere between about 4.5 and 5.8 billion US dollars. So that's roughly $7.5 billion Australian. That's the unit cost. It's very hard to come up with an accurate unit cost because the Americans don't tell you which bits are involved in costs that are counted against different programs like the combat management system, and the weapons will be in a different cost bucket and all of those sorts of things. So we have to take these as being rough ballpark figures. $7.5 billion is not a bad estimate for the unit cost of a Virginia-class submarine to Australia. And that also fits the $7.5 billion per annum cost before. So there's nothing that's out of whack here completely just yet. But I would make the observation that from what we know so far, that's probably very close to the same price as we will be paying for each of our Hunter-class frigates by the look of things.
Yeah.
So when you say, well, on the one hand, I can have a Virginia-class nuclear submarine for $7.5 billion. On the other hand, I can have a Hunter-class frigate for the same price. There's a bit of a problem there, for sure, that I won't explore necessarily any further. But just that comparison is really worth doing and understanding it from the point of view of the annual hit to the defence budget that is necessary to be provisioned for. I'd also note that I just picked up only in the last couple of days that the Canadians are in the market to acquire 12 3,000-tonne conventional submarines in the very near future to replace the 4 old conventional submarines that they bought retired by the British quite some years ago and with which they have had a lot of trouble. They have provisioned so far, so these are going to be 3,000 tonnes compared with the Virginia class, which are closer to 8,000 tonnes, nuclear versus conventional, and they have provisioned about 120 billion Australian dollars for that program. If I was to allow a very generous $20 billion for infrastructure and programmatics and other costs in that program, that gives me an average cost per submarine of 8.3 billion Australian dollars. That is a very expensive submarine for a 3,000.
For one that's less than half the size, and yes.
So the focus of attention on the cost of our submarines in total, I think, misses some important other factors that need to be taken into account, but which are very hard to get good, detailed information on. Now, a new hit of $7.5 billion per annum onto a defence budget, which is not changing, is absolutely a problem. If I was to take the cost per annum of our 6 conventional submarines away from that, because we're already paying that, so $7.5 billion per annum is the gross hit to the budget, but the net hit to the budget is going to be probably something like about $6.5 billion. Still a lot of money. Still a lot of money. And it might actually be even a little bit less than that. My estimate of $1 billion per annum on the conventional submarines.
And just to put that in context, the total defence budget is now running at sort of $55 to $60 billion per annum, isn't it?
It's about 50. It's edging towards 50 at the moment on the basis of next year's budget announced a few weeks ago. Now, Richard Dennis very correctly said, well, I hear talk of need for lot, and he was talking in the national budget sense. So I hear lots of aspiration for more defence spending. So there's a rule of law here. There is an economic rule of reality here that says, you want more of that? What are you going to have less of? Now that presupposes a zero-sum game, that the national budget is semi-fixed. I can apply exactly that same logic to the defence budget, which we know is semi-fixed, and it is not growing at a rate that is taking into account the military CPI, if you like, the military equipment CPI at all. So we're actually going backwards, and then to insert this whole new hit of something the size of 6.5, say, maybe even $6 billion, something's got to give in there. Either you increase the budget or you cut something out of the defence budget elsewhere. You cut something out of the defence force somewhere else. That's it. Well, if you're not going to change the budget, you want to spend more on that, you've got to spend less on something else. Now, my own view from the analysis that I've done over now some few years is that actually we've confronted this problem continuously for many years, and we have been underfunding the ADF quite significantly because we have not taken into proper account the total cost of ownership, that is to say, in large part, the biggest chunk of it, which is the in-service costs. We've never done that adequately. And so we have a whole lot of, very true in the Navy, a whole lot of areas of the Navy which are very run down for want of proper investment in the first place. We won't be able to afford to do that with nuclear-powered submarines. We will not be allowed to do that. We will have to be spending, there will be no discretion about spending the amount of money to keep them operating properly and safely. If they're Americans or if they're British, it doesn't matter. But the Americans ultimately will have the final say over how we go about properly maintaining their submarines, and those rules will equally apply with British origin submarines as well. Richard Dennis's point is absolutely right. Therefore, you have to have more money in the defence budget. But his point is equally valid about the national budget, which leads me to a previous point we discussed in part, which is to say, and this goes back to the tax summit that was held in Parliament House, run by the Australia Institute last year, at which Dr. Michael Keating very sensibly said, first, you have to figure out what are the services you want governments to provide, whether that be federal, state or local, and who is going to provide those services, at what level of performance, and what are those services going to cost. And once you've done all of that, and not until you've done all of that, can you determine how you're going to pay for them. Now, this is a circumstance that we're in large measure, and I think we see the struggles that federal treasurers face here, trying to bring about a balance or more or less balanced budget. And I mean, you would have a far more educated view on this than me, but I do seem to get the sense that a national budget in deficit, if it's relatively small, is not necessarily a bad thing.
I do think Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, which is usually depicted in the media as being left-leaning, and thus perhaps not the sort of person you would have expected to have found at the summit that you were at, but he made an important contribution that others have made, and I've said this a few times, that it's been clear since the last budget of the previous coalition presented by Josh Frydenberg in April of 2022, that government spending was set to be about 1.5 to 2 percentage points of GDP more over the next decade than the average that pertained between the end of the Whitlam years and the onset of the COVID pandemic. It was a remarkably stable average over that period. But since before the present government came to office, it's been accepted that government spending is going to be materially higher than it has been for 45 years before then. And in simple terms, there are three reasons for that. One is that the public very clearly wants more spending on health, aged and disability care, which is not surprising given that the proportion of the population who are aged and living with disability is going up over time. And it would also seem that there's a fairly widespread demand for more spending on childcare to allow more women to participate in work. And the public, I think, is also saying they're not going to vote for any political party that says you can't have that. Second, as we've been discussing, it's been very clear for some time, but it's especially obvious now, that Australia needs to spend more on defence. And that's not just because President Trump is saying that. It's evident for a whole lot of other reasons that we've been discussing. And the third thing is because governments have run up about $850 billion of debt since the global financial crisis, and the most recent budget papers are telling us that they're going to run up another $920 billion between now and 2035-36, that we're going to have to spend a lot more on interest.
Exactly.
And there's not many obvious ways of offsetting those sources of increased government spending by cutting spending in other areas. I mean, as people will know, I've been asking why are we giving Western Australia $7 billion a year more than they need to be able to provide the same standard of services whilst levying on their citizens the same level of taxes as people in what they like to call the eastern states. But even if you got rid of that, that wouldn't solve the problem. We actually do need to find ways of raising an additional, say, 1 to 1.5 percentage points of GDP in revenue from somewhere, ideally in the least economically damaging and fairest way. And if this were an ideal world between now and the election that's to be held on 3rd of May, both sides of politics would be seeking to have an adult conversation with the electorate as to what their view of the fairest and least economically damaging ways of raising the additional revenue required to pay for all this spending would be. But as I more often these days find myself saying, I've probably got a better chance of looking out my window of a morning and seeing a thylacine on the front lawn than I have of that conversation taking place, which is kind of very sad. I mean, maybe that's something that we can talk about the next time we get together.
Well, I absolutely agree with you. In fact, I would perhaps make a similar observation, perhaps more caustically, to say really disappointed with how small the thinking of our politicians seems to have become. If we can have a conversation the likes of this, where we advance a thought which is not unique to our heads, that there is a requirement for more money to be spent on defence, and we can arrive at a solution that also suggests that there is a need for tax reform in this country, amongst other significant reforms that you'd say are probably long overdue, and proper conversations with the electorate need to be had, and some of those would be the inevitable. A better discussion about whether or not we become a Republican and what that means, a much better conversation with the electorate about the things that are necessary to achieve with climate change, the sources of energy supply that we need to be creating. And the conversations around these, they're not rich, they're not big thinking ideas at all coming out of our politicians, yet they are abundantly necessary. It's abundantly clear that they're necessary. And I would say, add to that list things like the term of federal government every 3 years is stopping governments making some of these big things start. No one can really start the big ideas, have the sensible conversations with the electorate in the space of a 3-year term, and maybe fixed terms. But you don't have to think far and wide to come up with a need for Australia to have some very significant conversations about the Australia of the future, and some vision and big thinking from our politicians of all stripe. And we're just not really getting that at all, not so far in this election campaign, that's for sure.
And I doubt that we will over the remaining weeks of it. But maybe it's our role to continue this conversation so that maybe other people can be inspired to take it up. Rowan, thank you very much for participating in this one, and hopefully we'll talk about other related matters very soon.
Thanks very much, Saul. It's been a great pleasure.
Indeed.